The lobby of Cole Global was an expanse of polished marble and cold, filtered light. Nia Brooks stepped through the revolving doors, her pace steady despite the pulse hammering against her ribs. She kept her head down, a new analyst among hundreds of employees. Yet the secret in her pocket felt like a live wire. Her mother had held the truth for 30 years, and now it belonged to Nia. She crossed the atrium, the sound of her heels sharp against the floor. Near the elevators, a group of executives moved with practiced urgency. At the center of them stood Marcus Cole. He looked exactly as he did in the old, faded photographs, the same sharp angle of the jaw, the same detached authority. He did not look her way. He did not know she existed. Nia felt the weight of her identity pressing against her as she passed within 10 feet of him. She reached the security desk, scanned her badge, and moved toward the elevators. The doors slid shut, sealing her away from the lobby. She was inside now. She was a ghost in her father's machine, and she had until the end of the day to find the first crack in his empire. Nia spent the first 3 weeks buried in the digital expansion division. Her office was a glass-walled cube, barely large enough for her monitor and the endless streams of data she parsed daily. She worked long after the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline, the blue light of her screen the only illumination in the room. By her 4th week, the patterns began to emerge. It started with a series of fragmented payments, coded as infrastructure costs, totaling millions. She traced the first wire transfer through 3 different accounts. Every step was encrypted, hidden behind layers of offshore noise. She pulled a single file from the internal ledger and cross-referenced the destination bank. It was a shell company, registered to an address that did not exist. She checked a second transaction, then a third. The numbers were not errors. They were systematic drains on the company's core assets. Her fingers slowed over the keyboard. The trail did not lead to a low-level clerk or an outside vendor. She followed the routing numbers to a secure server node reserved exclusively for top-tier executive operations. The corruption was not a leak. It was a flood, and it was pouring directly from the floor where Marcus Cole sat. Nia printed the transaction logs and walked to Evelyn Price's office. She laid the papers on the desk. Evelyn scanned the figures, her face turning pale as she looked up. She whispered for Nia to leave the files and go home immediately. That was the last time Nia saw her. The next morning, Nia arrived at the office early. Evelyn's desk was empty. Her computer was logged off, her personal items gone, and her nameplate had been removed from the door. Nia reached for her phone, but a shadow fell across her desk. Richard Hale stood there, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not ask how she was doing. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, measured tone. Intelligence is a valuable asset at this firm, Nia. But loyalty is the only currency that matters. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt heavy in the room. People who dig into ledgers they do not understand often find themselves buried by them. He turned and walked away without looking back. Nia sat frozen, the realization hitting her with cold precision. She was no longer just an analyst. She was a target, and the game had shifted from accounting to survival. Nia did not wait for approval. She accessed the secure compliance server, dragged the files into the upload queue, and clicked send. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Before it finished, the heavy thud of boots sounded in the aisle. 3 security guards reached her desk simultaneously. They did not speak. They reached down, pulled the power cord from her tower, and forced her to stand. Richard Hale emerged from the crowd, holding a small silver storage device between his thumb and forefinger. He dropped it onto her desk, right next to her keyboard. "Found this in your bag, Nia," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the open floor. The office went silent. Nia stared at the device, knowing it contained nothing of hers. But the trap was already sprung. The guards gripped her arms, guiding her toward the elevators as her co-workers watched, eyes averted. No one spoke. No one intervened. She was marched past the glass walls of the offices she had worked in for months. As the lobby doors slid open, the weight of the moment settled in. Her access badge was collected, her laptop remained behind, and by the time she stepped onto the sidewalk, her reputation was gone. Nia sat in the dark of her living room, the city lights flickering against the wall. Her phone lay face down on the table, silent. A sharp knock at the door broke the stillness. It was Samuel Reed, the lawyer who had handled her mother's affairs for decades. He entered without preamble, carrying a thick, leather-bound folder. He placed it on the dining table and flipped it open. Nia leaned forward, scanning the lines of text. Her eyes caught the figures. 6% of Coal Global, held in a private trust since her birth. It was not just a fortune, it was a seat at the table. Samuel watched her, his expression unreadable as he explained the transfer protocols. The shares were hers to claim, effective immediately. The weight of her termination began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She looked at the documents, then at the clock. The board was scheduled to convene in less than 24 hours for an emergency audit. She stood up, gathered the files, and pulled a chair to the desk. The strategy for retaliation began to form. She was no longer an analyst fighting for her job. She was a shareholder coming for the board. The boardroom doors swung open. Nia walked toward the mahogany table, her footsteps echoing against the glass walls. The directors stopped their murmurs, turning to stare as she pulled out a chair at the far end. Richard Hale stood up, his face tightening, but Nia ignored him. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a faded photograph. With a steady hand, she slid it across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of Marcus Cole. The image showed a young woman cradling an infant, with a younger, unrecognizable version of Marcus standing beside them. Marcus looked down. His hands, previously resting flat on the table, gripped the edges of his chair until his knuckles turned white. The air in the room seemed to thin. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Nia. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the other executives shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Where did you get this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nia leaned forward, her expression unyielding. "My mother kept it hidden for 30 years, she replied. The corporate meeting ended the moment the photograph touched the wood. The battle for the company had become something far more dangerous, a confrontation with the past. Nia turned her back on Marcus and tapped a key on her tablet. Instantly, the boardroom screens flickered to life. Rows of fragmented payment logs, millions in diverted assets, and offshore shell company accounts flooded the display. Richard Hale surged to his feet, his jaw working as he tried to speak, but the data spoke louder. "These are the digital footprints of your $43 million theft," Nia stated, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Richard's face lost its color. He stammered, reaching for the remote, but the doors swung open again. Evelyn Price walked in, flanked by 2 federal investigators. The room erupted into a chaos of scraping chairs and sharp intakes of breath. Evelyn stopped beside Nia, holding a tablet of her own, confirming the digital trail with hard physical records. Richard backed away until he hit the glass wall. He did not fight when the investigators stepped forward. The heavy click of steel cuffs echoed in the sudden, absolute silence of the boardroom. As they guided him toward the exit, the empire he thought he owned began to dismantle itself. Marcus remained motionless, staring at the screen, watching his legacy crumble under the weight of his own flawed trust. The board sat paralyzed as the heavy doors clicked shut behind Richard. The empire was hemorrhaging value by the second. Stocks plummeted, and rumors of insolvency raced through the trading floors. Nia did not wait for an invitation. She walked to the head of the table, pulled the digital logs from the screen, and projected her own files. She displayed a comprehensive asset streamlining strategy, mapping out how to recover the diverted millions while protecting the wages of the thousands of employees currently fearing for their futures. Her voice was steady, methodical, and devoid of the chaos that had defined the morning. She identified the bloated divisions, pinpointed the immediate liquid assets, and laid out a timeline for investor stabilization. A senior director leaned forward, his hesitation vanishing as he scanned her projections. He nodded once. Then another director followed suit. Nia did not offer empty promises. She offered a tactical path out of the collapse. She commanded the room with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment for years. By the time she finished, the mood in the boardroom had shifted from panic to focus. The board members looked at each other, then at Marcus, and finally at Nia. The decision was unanimous. She was no longer the outsider. She was the architect of the empire's survival. The official appointment papers were signed within the hour. Nia became the chief financial officer, her name now printed on the masthead of the company she had been barred from only weeks ago. The real test, however, waited in the press gallery downstairs. Reporters packed the hall, their cameras creating a wall of artificial light. Marcus walked to the microphone, his movements slower than the public had ever seen. He did not look at the teleprompter. He spoke of his past, of the choices he made to protect his reputation, and of the daughter he had abandoned to maintain his own image. He dismantled his own untouchable facade with every sentence, admitting to the blind trust he placed in thieves while discarding his own blood. The room went silent. Nia stood in the wings, watching the man who had built an empire finally confess to its moral decay. As he stepped away from the podium, the cameras did not focus on his stature, but on his defeat. The board members, previously his loyal sycophants, now turned their attention toward Nia for direction. The power dynamic had undergone a permanent shift. Nia walked out to face the press, her expression calm and unyielding. She had fought for this respect, not as a gift from a father, but as a hard-won professional reality. The boardroom was empty, save for the hum of the ventilation and the distant glow of city lights against the glass. Nia stood by the window, her reflection ghosting over the skyline she now helped navigate. She heard the soft click of the door. Marcus walked in, his gait measured, his eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. He stopped a few feet behind her. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not reach out. He simply looked at the space where he had once held absolute, unchallenged power. "Your mother would have been proud," he said. His voice was steady, stripped of the bravado that had defined his life. Nia turned slowly. She looked at him, not with the anger of a victim, but with the clarity of an equal. "She already was," she replied. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was a space finally emptied of secrets. Marcus lowered his head, acknowledging the truth he had spent 30 years burying. He had built an empire to define the world, yet in the end, he had only learned that his own story possessed weight when it was finally, painfully, true. Nia watched him for a long moment, then turned back to the window, ready to face the morning.